So, good evening, everybody. Let's close the door and please find a seat. It's my absolute great pleasure to essentially present you the intellectual father of TNG. Yeah, because woohoo! Yeah, because you are such a pillar of clean thinking and making it funny to elucidate even the hard problems of the conditio humana for the non-Latins, the human condition. That it's just a great, essentially, like reading your books is like listening to a speaker who wants to send you on a far journey to a galaxy and place where nobody has been before. Yeah, you've been in a galaxy of thought and went through many interesting places, of course, like Harvard or MIT, in New England, places full of interesting people to talk to listen to think together with. And fortunately, you created a ton of interesting artifacts. In the old world, they were called books. Yeah. And these books are a joy to read. You know, there are these books where people say they read them and they put them into their cupboard. And if there's a cocktail party, you make sure that people see that you have the book. Like Gödel, Escher, Bach, it was one of these books by Douglas Hofstadter, but hardly anybody ever read it. But your books are actually being read. Yeah, and that's a big achievement in nowadays ways. And it's not just read by Anthropic ripping it apart and feeding it into the newest Claude, but actually human beings with a medium-size biological language models, BLMs. Yeah, so. We tried to learn from your books and have it presented, the ideas presented, the algorithms, the thought structures to our employees and also to our guests and friends. And fortunately, as you created so many artifacts, we today have the chance to look at a life of artifacts, of works of thinking art that resulted in communicable ideas that are worth thinking. Please read the long details on Wikipedia if you like, but here's a soul that has always been shining. And so I'm very, very grateful that you jumped onto a plane and are here today. Dear Stephen, thanks for being here for the 4th time, and thanks for all your great thoughts.
Thank you, Henrik. Thanks to all of you for coming. It is always a thrill to attend these meetings, to meet you, and to see the future happening now. I thought I would, after consulting with Henrik on what we thought you might find interesting, I thought I would talk a bit about the intellectual trajectory that took a cognitive psychologist, an academic, a guy who publishes in obscure journals, to my interest in global trends, the arc of human progress. How did I get here? I began with an interest in cognitive processes, particularly vision and visual cognition. How do we recognize objects and faces? How do we direct our attention across the visual field, look in one place and attend to some other place? How do we form mental images in the mind's eye, particularly of three-dimensional space and three-dimensional objects? At the same time, I was interested in cognitive processes kind of in the other hemisphere of the brain, namely language. How do children acquire language? How does language work? How does it change over time? What is the trade-off between memory and computation in language processes? And I was quite content to continue to do experiments and to publish studies, but I began to feel a desire to communicate what cognitive science had discovered to a wider audience. One of my editors at a university press said, "You're not like most academics, your writing doesn't suck. Have you ever thought of writing a book not just for your fellow academics, but for a larger audience?" So that led me to write my 3rd book, but my first book that was actually sold in stores and that people actually read, and this was called The Language Instinct, where I tried to explain everything that people wanted to know about language. Just based on my conversations with people, they would ask me, "What do you do for a living?" I'd say, "I'm a cognitive scientist, I study language." They would always say, "Oh, that's really interesting," and have some question. And I thought there is a demand for accessible explanations of how language works. There were bestsellers on evolution, there were bestsellers on dinosaurs, there were bestsellers on black holes and space-time, but there were no bestsellers or even accessible books on language and mind. So I wrote The Language Instinct, and I organized it. I didn't want to just have a whole set of disconnected facts, but I organized it around a key idea captured in the title. The title comes from a quotation from Charles Darwin. Man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, while no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. This is a beautiful quote, so I adapted it to the title of my book, The Language Instinct. It was also consistent with the approach to language that was famously associated by my MIT colleague, Noam Chomsky, that humans have an inborn ability to learn to speak. After I published The Language Instinct, a question that I got is, well, if language is a human instinct, what are the other instincts? And I wrote a book called How the Mind Works on the other evolved components of the human mind. Recognizing objects, doing mental arithmetic, emotions like fear and anger and guilt and an appreciation of beauty. Again, in an evolutionary framework, what are, I ask, did the different parts of the mind evolve to do? It's the first question you ask about a physical organ. Why do we have a spleen? Why do we have a pancreas? Why do we have a liver? And I ask the question, why do we have fear? Why do we have jealousy? Why do we remember recent things better than more distant things? I discovered in the reaction to the book, How the Mind Works, that not all of the responses were scientific arguments, that there was a lot of emotion, even a lot of politics brought up by the very concept of human nature, the very idea that we are animals, we evolved by natural selection, the brain has an innate structure, we are not blank slates. I discovered that this is a very controversial, emotional, politicized question. And because I thought the science of the human mind was distorted by these political issues, I wrote a book about the moral and political and emotional coloring of the concept of human nature. That was a book called The Blank Slate, sometimes translated as Tabula Rasa, in which I presented evidence that there is such a thing as human nature. We are not blank slates, but then asked, why is it so politically incorrect? Nowadays, we might say, why is it so woke to believe in the blank slate? And I examined some of the controversies. One of them is, it's very comforting. It's very politically correct to believe that we are blank slates, because that means we have to be equal. Because if we're born with nothing, everyone is born with the same nothing. 0 equals 0 equals 0. And there's no possibility for racism or sexism or ethnic prejudice because there's simply no difference between us. Now, I pushed back at that, and I said the ideal of equality, the reason that we should not be prejudiced or bigoted or sexist, is not because we're all clones or we're all blank slates, but because we have a commitment to treat people as individuals and not to prejudge them by the category that they belong to, their race, their sex, their sexual orientation. So I tried to separate the scientific issue, what are we born with, from the moral and political issue, how should we treat people? I think they were often conflated. But the other issue that I argued was pushed people to want to believe that we're blank slates, is that people had an idea that somehow that's more progressive, more hopeful, more optimistic. Because if you say, well, it's human nature and you can't change human nature, doesn't that say that we can cannot try to make the world a better place, because humans are humans and they will screw it up no matter what you do. And historically, there has been something of a correlation between more conservative, even reactionary politics and a belief in human nature, and more progressive politics and a belief in the blank slate. Now, both can be distorted. We know that the totalitarian regimes of Stalin and Mao were based on the blank slate. They said so explicitly, that a newborn is like a blank sheet of paper on which the most beautiful poems can be written, and that justified the government taking control of every aspect of society. So I argued that it is actually not so beneficial to believe in a blank slate. That can be distorted. But that the main point is that there's nothing incompatible between a belief in human nature and the prospect of progress. The reason is, two main reasons. One of them is that human nature is not one thing. There's an awful lot that's going on inside a brain. There are different systems, components, modules that push and pull, inhibit and excite each other. Excuse me. Even if human nature includes some rather unpleasant motives, like the desire to dominate, or the thirst for revenge, or the capability of sadism, or the possibility of exploitation, the dark side of human nature also has the capacity for self-control. We have these big prefrontal cortex that can inhibit our impulses so that we don't have to lash out, but we can stop and count to 10 and think about the consequences of our behavior. We have a sense of empathy, where we can consider the well-being of others and treat it like our own. We have cognition, problem solving, where we can set out problems like violence or exploitation and figure out social arrangements to try to reduce them, just like we solve technological problems. And so I said that a belief in human nature does not rule out progress, especially since our capacity for cognition and for language are not a set of fixed responses, but they are an open-ended, recursive, combinatorial system. We can build complex ideas out of simple ideas and still more complex ideas out of the complex ideas. There's no limit to the range of ideas that the human mind can explore, and hence the range of solutions to social problems that we can come up with. And thanks to our language instinct, we can share our discoveries and accumulate them over time. And I gave a couple of examples. We know, for example, that slavery used to be ubiquitous across civilizations. Every civilization practiced slavery. Every civilization abolished slavery at some point. We knew that the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, the Warsaw Pact, went out of existence with very little violence. And I quoted one historical study that I came across, that a historian went back to look at homicide data in England from the 14th century to the present. Many people have a stereotype that life was simpler and more peaceful centuries ago and that we've become more violent. But if you look at the data on homicide from old government and church records, it actually goes way, way down, so that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestor. Anyway, one year I was asked to contribute to an annual feature on a website which asked a different question every year and had several dozen scientists and intellectuals answer the question. One year the question was, what are you optimistic about? So I said, so I reiterated the arguments I made in the Blank Slate that there are undeniable examples of progress in the sense of violence going down. Slavery and the fall of totalitarian communism, the decline of homicide in England, the fact that that hunter-gatherers who represent our ancestors' way of life have far greater rates of death in warfare than we do even in the 20th century. Well, it was posted. Then I started to get correspondence from scholars from many parts of the world who said, I really liked your little post, but there are other examples you could have cited of violence going down over time. One political scientist said, did you know that rates of death in warfare since 1946 have come down? And he sent me his graph. Someone else said, it isn't just England where homicide rates were higher in the Middle Ages. It's also Italy and Germany and France and Switzerland and Scandinavia. Every country had a decline in homicide. Someone else said, you could have also mentioned that abuse of children, corporal punishment and spanking and beating children has gone down. Someone else said, I have data showing that violence against women has gone down. Spousal abuse, sexual assaults have gone down. And I thought, my goodness, seems to be a pattern here. None of these scholars knows about any of the others. All of these data came as a surprise to me. I knew that very few people outside of these narrow disciplines even knew that there were all of these declines of violence. And so I had to write a book about it, just to spread these fascinating findings, and as a psychologist to try to explain them. Explain, first of all, why our ancestors were so violent. Why do people enslave and rape and kill each other? But also, how did we manage to bring it down? What is the plasticity? What are the innovations in the human mind that allow us to go from our ancestors' way of life to a much more civilized way of life? An old-fashioned way of putting it, but I think quite accurate. That book was called in English, The Better Angels of Our Nature. That was a phrase I stole from Abraham Lincoln, but it captured the idea that I've already mentioned to you, that human nature is not one thing. There are many angels and demons, and it is interesting to identify what the better angels are that manage to bring violence down. Well, then, I'll give you one more step in my intellectual autobiography. That is, I went to a conference, an interdisciplinary conference, people in many fields, and there were reporters going around asking random people questions. And one of them asked me, what will it take to eliminate poverty across the world? And I said, well, redefining poverty. Well, an expert on international development said, that's a very cynical answer. Did you know that poverty has plummeted worldwide? That it used to be that 90% of humanity lived in extreme poverty, using a constant definition. Now it's less than 10%. I was intrigued. This is another example of human progress, not in the realm of violence, but it led me to start looking at other aspects of human well-being, not just safety, where I discovered, as with violence, that progress is a real phenomenon. That many dimensions of human well-being, things have really gotten better. This is not optimism. This is not seeing the glass as half full versus half empty. This is actual hard data, and which have, again, raised the question, how did it happen? So that was the subject of my book called Enlightenment Now. And I'll just, to let you know what I'm talking about, I'll present a few slides on what I mean by human progress, data on human progress, and also a bit of the psychology of why it's so hard to see human progress, and perhaps even what causes it. So first of all, can we switch to my slides? I'll ask the question quickly, so I'll have time to have a conversation with our host today. What is progress? How can we tell whether there's been progress? Are we still making progress today? And this is a frequently asked question. Enlightenment Now came out in 2018, and some people say to me, yeah, well, things were okay then, but hasn't the world fallen apart since 2018? So everything that you said in 2018, we've erased all that progress since then. And why is progress so hard, and how can it happen at all? So what is progress? By progress, I mean improvements in human flourishing, where human flourishing consists of qualities like life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, and happiness. These can be measured. If you plot them over time, and the good things go up and the bad things go down, that's what I mean by progress. Now, has there been progress? Well, here's how not to tell whether there has been progress, and that is to follow the news. The news is a highly misleading way of perceiving trends in the world for a couple of reasons. One is that news is what happens, not what doesn't happen. And there are many, many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. If something goes wrong, the news is a highly non-random sample, and it will present it to you. But if a part of the world has been at peace, if a city has not been attacked by terrorists, if there is not a famine or a epidemic in some part of the world, that's not news. Also, news is what happens suddenly, not what happens gradually. Some things change the world a few percentage points a year, which then compound, but there's never a Thursday in October in which it happens, and so people who read the news every day or every hour or every minute can be completely ignorant of it. Also, a news is what changes, not what persists. So let me give you a hypothetical example. Imagine there's some dimension of human well-being. Let's say this is life expectancy. So most years it goes up, but some years nothing increases monotonically, let alone linearly. There are always wiggles and setbacks, as you can see in this hypothetical curve. Now, you're a journalist. Let's say life expectancy has gone up 10 years in a row. Well, after year 7, well, that's not news. It's the same as last year. Year 8, well, that's not news. That's the same as last year. Year 9, that's not news. All of a sudden, it goes down. Well, that's news. For the first time, life expectancy has gone down. Well, then it resumes its upward climb, and again, boring, 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 until the next time it reverses. And so that becomes news, and so on. And so the only thing that people ever read about are the setbacks, the reversals. The continuing improvement is completely invisible to someone who reads the news. And also, as a psychologist, I realized that the practice of journalism interacts with two cognitive biases to give us a distorted picture of trends. One of them is what is called the availability bias. This was discovered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for this and other discoveries and had a bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he explained it. The availability bias is that our sense of probability, of trends, of prevalence is determined by available anecdotes from memory, images, narratives, particular events that call to mind. If it's easy to remember something, we think that it is common. And the negativity bias, we are far more impressed by negative emotions, negative events than by positive ones. Probably for evolutionary reasons, you can be much more damaged by something goes wrong than you can be helped by something that goes right, and so it makes sense to be more vigilant for the downside. Because of the interaction between the practice of journalism and these cognitive biases, there's a natural sense that everything is getting worse and always has been getting worse. A better way to tell whether there has been progress, and this I hope should be obvious, is to plot data on human well-being over time. And by doing that, there are constant pleasant surprises. Again, this is not optimism. This is not seeing the glass as half full. This is not looking on the bright side. This is just looking at data instead of journalism. Let's start with life. Here's a graph of life expectancy from 1950 to 2023. And I mentioned that nothing is perfectly monotonic. There are always setbacks. You can see, let's see, do I have a laser pointer? I don't think I do, but let's see if I can, no. Oh, yes, I do. So here you have, whoops, very hard to control this. This dip is COVID. But as you can see, the world recovered from that setback. If data from 2024 and 2025 are even higher. And it is not just in the developed world, the first world, but in every region, including Africa. Now, there's still obviously a big gap between Africa and the developed world, but Africa too has seen continuing rises in life expectancy. What about health? Things that don't actually kill you? Well, here's a graph of years lost to death and disability over the last 35 years. Again, you can see a bulge, a setback. Whoops. Not sure what I'm doing here. From COVID, but the world has recovered from that. Sustenance, that is food. Contrary to predictions that were common when I grew up and when I was in college, made famous by the late biologist Paul Ehrlich, he died earlier this year, who wrote a bestseller called The Population Bomb, which wrote with absolute certainty that by the 1970s, there would be massive worldwide famines that would kill hundreds of millions of people because population grows exponentially, food production grows linearly, famine is inevitable, the famous argument of Thomas Malthus. In reality, though population has increased over the last 200 years, deaths from famine have decreased at the same time, so Malthus and Ehrlich were wrong. If we now zoom in on the last portion and look at, in this case, not famine that kills people, but just undernourishment, fewer calories than are necessary. You find that in most regions of the world, undernourishment has gone down, though it must be pointed out that here is a case where there is somewhat of a reversal, that over the last 10 or 15 years, Africa has been going in the wrong direction when it comes to nutrition. What about overall prosperity? Well, here is a graph from economic historians that plots gross world product over the last 2 millennia. And as you can see, for 1,500 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and global prosperity increased by about 200-fold. If we zoom in on the last few years, we see that growth increases. Once again, there is a notch from COVID, but the world has recovered since then. Now, a cynic could look at that and say, well, yeah, it's all going to the top 1%. Of course, this is dominated, the average is dominated by all the billionaires, maybe pretty soon a trillionaire or two. But in fact, that is not what is happening, that the prosperity is distributed. If you look at extreme poverty, as I mentioned before, by a constant definition in constant dollars and purchasing power. As I mentioned, the world has gone from 90% of humanity living in extreme poverty 200 years ago to less than 9% today. This graph goes to 2015. Let's zoom in on the last few years. And as you can see, extreme poverty continues to decline. What about peace? This is a graph showing the 20th century and the first 5 years of the 21st. And I don't need to tell you that the 20th century was marked by two pretty horrific spikes in bloodletting corresponding to the two world wars. But an interesting thing happens if you zoom in on the period since World War II, which is that the rate of deaths, the global death rate in wars of all kinds, though very bumpy, has gone down. And even with the recent increase because of the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, and in Ethiopia, it has reversed the trend a bit. Has taken us back to the level of the 1980s, the late 1980s, but we're still better off than we were during the 80s, the 70s, and the 50s. What about freedom and rights? Well, there are organizations that try to track the level of democracy in countries across the world, not a dichotomy between democracy or autocracy, a binary, but rather a continuous scale. And this shows that from 1950 to 2023, there's been a notable increase. You can see in the last few years there's been something of a droop. A number of countries, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, the United States have gotten a little less democratic, but we're still way better off than we were when half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain, when Spain and Portugal and Greece were military dictatorships, when all of Latin America was controlled by military dictatorships, when Taiwan, South Korea were dictatorships, and so on. Here's a graph showing women's empowerment. Again, there are organizations that try to quantify women's rights. One can see the increase with a little bit of a droop in the last few years. Here we have an index of LGBTQ rights, again, increase in several different criteria. What about violent crime? I mentioned that there was a huge decrease since the Middle Ages. You can see it here in Italy, Netherlands, Germany, England, and Scandinavia. If we zoom in on the last two decades, this is a graph for the world as a whole. You can see that homicide has been in gentle decline. Knowledge, we are naturally illiterate. Unlike spoken language, which, as I argued, can be seen as an instinct, and as Darwin noted, no child has an instinctive tendency to write. This has to be learned. But over the course of history, over the last 20 years, literacy has gone from about 15% of humanity to more than 90% of humanity. And a basic education, that is at least some formal schooling, again, that has gone from about 10% of humanity to more than 80%. Finally, happiness. Does any of this matter if it doesn't make us happy? Well, this is hard. We don't have data surveying people's happiness a couple of hundred years ago, but we do know that in general, as countries get richer, most of them get happier. This is a graph showing data on countries for which there were two measurements, at least, on happiness since the 1980s. And as you can see, a majority of them, not all of them, have gotten happier over the last 40 years. If we zoom in on the last couple of decades, we see this is the only graph I could find was divided into young people and old people, people that is 15 to 24 or over 25. And globally, The world as a whole has gotten somewhat happier, although there is a lot of variation from country to country, and from demographic to demographic. And you can find lots of particular sectors that have gotten less happy, but the world as a whole seems to have gotten more happy. Perhaps suicide is the ultimate assay for whether life is worth living. And one more fact that very few people are aware of, and that is the global suicide rate has gone down by about 40 percentage points since 1980. So just summarize 14 global trends that I've briefly mentioned. In the last 20 years or so, 10 of them, the historical progress has continued: life, health, prosperity, poverty, gay rights, homicide, literacy, education, and happiness, and suicide. Some of the trends have stalled or even are somewhat backtracking: women's rights since 2010, nutrition since 2005 to 2010. Democracy has been in a quantitative decline since 2000. Peace since 1990. But the number of trends that have been, where the progress has been erased, that is, we're worse off now than we were in the 20th century, 0. So that's the kind of my latest update on global progress. I've kind of explained where the world is now, and I've also explained my own progress and how, starting from an interest in mental processes like language and vision, I ended up interested in the progress of humanity as a whole. So I think now I will, I have some more slides on why progress is so hard, but I think I've spoken long enough, and I will transition now to a conversation with our fearless leader, Henrik.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. The good news is that we can ask all of you many questions that you would like to have answered, not by me, but by our guest. Yeah. Fortunately, I get to ask maybe the first 1 or 2 or 3 questions. And first of all, I have to say I'm personally very happy that even though there are so many, there's even something called the dark triad of human personality. So even though the dark triad exists, it seems that if we are all together, it's a little bit less dark. Yeah. And do you think that's literally true?
That is that, well, the dark triad, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, they're kind of related. I mean, there are only a minority of people who have the dark triad. Unfortunately, some of them like to attain positions of political power. And so I think I'm not saying this humorously, I'm actually saying this seriously, that because people with the dark triad, they often crave power. So they try to become leaders of countries. I won't name any names, but one can see that that democracy, the essence of democracy isn't so much giving people the vote, although that's a component of it, but it was quite explicit in the deliberations that led to the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution that protecting countries against, they didn't use the word dark triad, that's a bit of psychology jargon. They called them tyrants, the American founders, and of course there were predecessors from ancient Greece and Rome, so they knew all about people with dark triads taking over governments. And so a lot of the American Constitution and the Constitution of other democracies was explicitly engineered to prevent dark triad types from having too much power. And a big debate in the United States now is how well are those safeguards holding? So you asked about a whole people acting collectively. Well, they're only a minority of them will have the dark triad. There's some reason to think that at least some of our cognitive flaws can be mitigated when people have to deliberate in groups. That's kind of the rationale behind the wisdom of crowds, behind democracy, behind organizations like scientific societies and scholarly societies.
TNG.
and companies, that every individual has cognitive biases and limitations. We all of us think we're right. Not all of us can be right, but we don't recognize our own biases, but we're much better at recognizing the other guy's biases. And so if you have people in a forum with, crucially, with freedom of speech, so you don't get punished for criticizing someone else's idea, that holds out the hope that a whole community with norms of open criticism, open debate, can be smarter, more rational than any of the individuals in it.
I said he's the spiritual father of TNG. Yeah. Anyway, so this is good news because it means that probably you don't have to write a book about the dark triad. But if you write a new book, or you wrote a new book, so what's the newest topic that we should learn about, think about?
Well, my most recent book, which I have not mentioned at all so far, is called "When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows ... And I think the German translation is pretty literal. This refers to a phenomenon called common knowledge, a technical term from game theory and philosophy and economics, referring to the case in which two people not only know something, but Alice knows that Bob knows it, and Bob knows that Alice knows it, and Alice knows that Bob knows that Alice knows it, and Bob knows that Alice knows that Bob knows that Alice knows it, ad infinitum. That's why there's the ... And the reason, the book is about common knowledge. Why write a whole book on common knowledge? Well, one of them is just as a psychologist, I'm interested in thinking, and so naturally I'm interested in thinking about thinking and thinking about thinking about thinking. But also, it's the reason that it has attracted so much interest among specialists in philosophy, in economics, in political science, in game theory, in electronics, is that common knowledge is necessary for coordination, for two or more people to be on the same page. So imagine, say, that two people, a couple is separated in New York. One of them, the cell phone has gone dead, and they somehow have to find each other. It's not enough for each one to know something, such as the husband thinks, well, my wife likes to go to a bookstore, so I'll meet her there. But she's thinking, well, he likes to go to the camera store, so I'll go there. And then he thinks, well, she knows that I know that she likes to go to the bookstore, so she will go to the bookstore after all, so I'll go there, and so on ad infinitum. Nothing short of common knowledge gets people on the same page to coordinate. This is the problem in society, in relationships, in large-scale organization, is how do you get people, indeed, how do you get intelligent agents to do something that works if both of them do it the same way? Now, in a society, there are many conventions that allow us to coordinate our behavior, like driving on the right or driving on the left. It doesn't matter which side it is, as long as everyone agrees on the same side. Or using paper currency. You exchange something of value for a piece of paper because you know someone else will take the piece of paper in exchange for something of value. Why do they do it? They know that someone else will exchange it for something of value. As long as the common knowledge persists. Conversely, when the common knowledge disappears, then you can get hyperinflation, or you can get a bank run in which people withdraw their savings, not because they think the bank is unsound, but because they think that other people might think that other people think that the bank is unsound, and they anticipate the bank run causing the bank run. And during COVID, at least in the United States, people started to hoard toilet paper. Not because there was a shortage of toilet paper, but because there's a rumor or a stereotype that toilet paper is in short supply during an emergency, like a hurricane or a blackout. And so people buy toilet paper because they think everyone else will buy toilet paper because they think that those people think that everyone else will buy toilet paper. Or in the other direction, speculative bubbles like cryptocurrency. You buy crypto not because you want to buy drugs or weapons, but because you hear that other people want to buy it because they think the price will increase. Why would they do that? Because, well, they think that other people will buy it in anticipation that it will increase. And so you can get a bubble, which, of course, can't go on forever. My interest in common knowledge was also that our not just legal arrangements and financial arrangements like driving on the right or using paper currency depend on common knowledge, but our informal social relationships, our friendships, our romance, our dominance hierarchies, all exist because people think they exist. What makes two people friends? Well, you don't sign a contract. Each one knows the other one thinks they're friends and knows that the other one knows that they know that you're friends, or lovers. Or in a hierarchical relationship, the dominant stands his ground because he knows the subordinate will give way, and the subordinate gives way because he knows the dominant will stand his ground. And I suggest in this book that a lot of our rituals of communication, politeness, innuendo, euphemism, white lies, connecting the dots, not blurting out what you mean, together with nonverbal communication like eye contact, like blushing, like crying, like laughing, all of these regulate the sharing of common knowledge or the denial of common knowledge, keeping certain things that each one knows private so that you know it, but you don't know that the other person knows that you know it. Anyway, that's the topic of the book. The subtitle in English is Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life.
Theory of everything. It's not just Einstein, it's also Stephen. Here's an interesting question related to your book, because what I thought about your talk today is you think that human nature does exist, it is understandable, it shows itself in human behavior in the real world. So having an idea of the universality seems to be a very good strategy. And now, obviously, cultures differ. Or no, maybe I should be careful. Sentences like obviously cultures differ. Well, at least let's assume that there are different cultures or perceptions of human universality, so there are gaps. And I wonder whether these gaps are more due to like a cognitive dissonance or not enough thinking about a certain subject, or whether a denial of universal human nature is usually connected to power systems, like the Communist Party.
Well, very, very often it is, especially for cases of massive power, like the communist totalitarian regimes. But there are other sources of differences between cultures. Even a very, very, very simple one of driving on the right versus driving on the left. Often a whole community or collective can prosper if they all make the same arbitrary choice, as long as they're all on the same page. So it could mean that it's, as in the case of driving, it's rational to drive on the right if everyone drives on the right. It's rational to drive on the left if everyone drives on the left. Who's to say one's better than the other? It's just very important that everyone don't do it the same way. And maybe a lot of cultural differences of how you behave when you're in Japan or Saudi Arabia are different equilibria where cultures all agree to do something in a particular way because of the advantages of doing it the same way. Now, this could also mean that you get locked into a maladaptive system. It can be hard to change, path dependence, and it can sometimes be very difficult to change because everyone has to change at the same time. So in 1969, Sweden, which up to that point, they drove on the left. But it was kind of ridiculous to drive on the left when the rest of Europe was driving on the right. So they had the problem. That's something you cannot do incrementally. You cannot do it gradually. It can't be up to every individual. And so they needed this is actually one more concept I should have mentioned. Often, coordination dilemmas and common knowledge are generated by a focal point, something that is unique, discrete, salient, that everyone notices at the same time. Going back to our couple separated in New York, how can they find each other? Well, this is a problem that goes back to the great political scientist Thomas Schelling. He won a Nobel Prize in economics, and he introduced this problem, where he proposed that something called a focal point, sometimes called a Schelling point in his honor, is something that is so conspicuous and salient that each one can guess that it will pop into the mind of the other. In the case of the couple in New York, they might meet at the big prominent brass clock in Grand Central Station, at noon. Not necessarily because that was where they had been separated, or it may not even have been close to where they are, but each one can think, well, where would I meet if I had to meet somewhere and my husband is thinking the same thing? That focal point, something that pops into everyone's mind, would be the natural solution. But it has to be discrete, it has to be salient. So in the case of Sweden, they decided, I think it was midnight, January 1st, 1969, heavily advertised beforehand, that's the exact time that we all switch over. Other transitions, though, are not as easy to flip, and so cultures can get stuck in maladaptive focal points. Just an example of going back to, say, Saudi Arabia, something more consequential than driving on the left or driving on the right is, should women be allowed to drive? Now, for various reasons, as you know, until recently in Saudi Arabia, women were not allowed to drive. This was an interesting case of common knowledge or mutual knowledge. There's a state called pluralistic ignorance. That's where no one believes something, but everyone mistakenly believes that everyone else believes it. In the case of Saudi Arabia, no man actually thought that it was a good idea to prevent people from driving. But they all thought that everyone else was opposed to women driving, even though no one was opposed to women driving. This can often happen in various kinds of prejudice, in, say, prejudice against gay people, homophobia. Everyone thinks that everyone else thinks that homosexuality is a sin. Turns out no one actually thinks it, but everyone thinks that everyone else thinks it. So how do you explode pluralistic ignorance? Pluralistic ignorance is often held in place by the fear of punishment. This is another reason why freedom of speech is so important. That when people think they will be punished for saying something, no one says it. If no one says it, you have no idea that no one believes it. For that reason, pluralistic ignorance is also called a spiral of silence. As people are inhibited, it entrenches itself because no one actually says it. So it sometimes takes one brave person to break the spiral of silence, to shatter the pluralistic ignorance, as in the story of the emperor's new clothes. That's how I begin the book. When the little boy said the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling them anything they didn't already know. They could see the emperor was naked. But the point of the story is anyone who couldn't see the emperor's wonderful clothes was showing that he was an idiot, because only wise people could see the clothes. So no one was going to say, I don't see the clothes. That's what led to the spiral of silence. It was broken by the little boy who didn't know any better and did not fear the punishment.
So I have 10 more questions, but I had my 3, so I think it's time to ask you for your questions. So Irina, there's already somebody right next to you who would like to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Matthias from the Mindshift. I want to talk or ask you about the common knowledge and creativity. So common knowledge kind of converges on the expected and on that is common knowledge. At the same time, we humans prize very highly creativity, which is often a solution to a problem that is not common, and that it's out of the way. How do the two concepts, how do you reconcile them? What role does creativity play in this perspective?
Yeah, I suppose that the connection might be that if it's kind of common knowledge that, and in this case, common belief, common perhaps false belief that some problem is unsolvable or there's only one way to solve it, that can inhibit people from trying to come up with a new solution. That could inhibit creativity, and perhaps you need the equivalent of the boy in the emperor's new clothes who is unaware of the social sanction of breaking the, in this case, common misconception. The puzzle in creativity, and I have given some thought to it, is it is not enough that a suggestion be novel or that no one else has thought about it, because the vast majority of ideas are wrong. And the puzzle of creativity is not so much how does someone come up with a new idea that no one has ever thought of before, but how does someone come up with a new good idea that's worth paying attention to when someone thinks of it. Because often the reason that some new idea is not tried is it's a bad idea. So I've given some thought to that. I think that a lot of it, a lot of creative epiphanies are either combinations of ideas that were all sitting isolated that for the first time someone brings together. Because there's a combinatorial explosion of ways in which two ideas can be brought together. But the person who can find the one that, perhaps by some equivalent of mental gradient descent, can a new combination of parameter settings gives you an increment of improvement, might be one route. Another one might be through analogy, that there are commonalities between superficially different systems that someone notices that they are both examples of the same system and makes the leap from one to another. So for example, Newton, thinking that the relationship between the sun and a planet is like the relationship between a pole and a tetherball. They're centripetal systems where there is linear momentum, there's a centripetal force, and the result is circular motion. Or Darwin making the leap from pigeon breeders artificially selecting for some trait and the natural difference between which organisms live and which organisms die being a natural selection. Even in technological improvements, often there has to be a change, some kind of analogy that occurs to the first person as a creative leap. So I once read a story about how the synthetic paintbrush was invented, as opposed to using animal bristles. Turns out that plastic bristles resulted in a bad brush. And no one could figure out why until someone realized that a brush is not a paddle that wipes paint on a surface, but it's a pump, and that the spaces between the bristles were like pipes, and that bending the paintbrush is pumping paint out through those hundreds of microscopic pipes. Not smearing, but pumping. That analogy, which turns out to be apt, was a way in which a creative leap led to a technological innovation.
Hi, thanks for the refresher on not everything being shit. I believe that an antidote to cognitive biases like negativity bias and catastrophization in general maybe is to imagine the happy path vividly. So could you share any concrete ideas you have how the challenges we face with respect to AI risk, climate change, great power conflict, etc., go well over the next 50 to 100 years? Feel free to paint a picture. Thanks.
50 to 100 years. Here I have to have some humility, excuse me, being familiar with the literature on forecasting. So we all know that if you look at, again, I hate to keep dumping on journalism, but if you look at predictions made by pundits, columnists, they're basically random. That is, if you go back 5 years, you see what the experts predict, you see what actually happened, then they're throwing darts blindfolded. But there are what are called super forecasters who actually have a positive track record of predicting events in the future, basically using Bayesian methods. They look up the background rates, the base rates. They specifically avoid cognitive biases like overconfidence, like availability. And they do a Bayesian estimate. Will the price of petroleum exceed a certain level in the next 12 months? Will there be a major terrorist attack on a European city in the next 24 months? Hard and fast predictions like that. And the super forecasters are pretty good at, much better than experts who are not super forecasters. However, their rate of accuracy falls to chance after 5 years. So beyond 5 years, basically no one can predict the future with any kind of precision, which is why I would be very hesitant to predict it for 50 to 100 years. I tend to be, even though I have denied that the case for progress is a case for optimism. What I emphasize is it's just looking at data rather than headlines. But I will confess that I am something of an optimist, based just on the discovery that there has been so much progress. Our ancestors saw problems, they tried to solve them. If they kept what worked, if they did not repeat their mistakes, then gradually progress happened. And so it seems that our background assumption should be that progress will continue to happen, that problems are solvable. I like to quote the physicist David Deutsch, pioneer in quantum computing, who said, "Unless something is ruled out by the laws of nature, all problems are solvable given the right knowledge." So that means that progress is possible. Looking back suggests that progress, that's not just a theoretical possibility, but it has happened. Certainly in the case of AI, I think it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that AI is a kind of magic, a kind of omnipotence that can just solve any problem. Predictions that we're going to cure cancer in 5 years, I think, are ridiculous, simply because learning about the world has a speed limit determined by the world. You have to do experiments, you've got to gather data, you've got to see what happens when you apply treatments and whether the tumor shrinks or not. Unless AI is omniscient about every molecule in the universe, like Laplace's famous demon, a lot of knowledge is going to be limited by the rate of physical processes in the world, and by the fact that we will never have data on the position and velocity of every molecule in the universe. So there are going to be built-in limits. Nonetheless, I think there are sober predictions about what AI could do. Automate dangerous and boring tasks, accelerate discovery when there are combinatorially explosive spaces, and people in this audience know them far better than me. I'll add one asterisk, though. and this I'm sure has occurred to many of you, and it's of course occurred to the people who are worried about AI safety, is that the expectation based on the past is may not be a good guide to tail risks, to things that are extremely improbable but potentially catastrophic, as in nuclear war in the case of international relations. And there's a whole industry of people thinking up what I consider to be rather preposterous scenarios of how AI could go rogue, could seek to take over, could treat us the way we treat animals, could use us as raw materials to pursue some goal. I tend to suspect, I tend to think that those are highly unlikely, but of course the probability is not zero, so we ought to think about preventing them from happening.
So I just try to do groupthink and ask two very capable persons over here, the government, how many more questions, and they said 2 more questions. Maybe Irina, you the first question.
Hello, so my question is regarding the notions of progress that you mentioned earlier. So the ones you mentioned, like sustenance, poverty, I think we can all agree on if the needle moves into the right direction, then that is progress. But there's of course also different categories and topics that might be a bit more complex, like let's say equality, like how many women are working in STEM, how many men are working in care jobs. So can we all come to a common agreement on also this complex topic of where should the needle move?
Yeah, so it is certainly true that the question of whether progress has happened has to be relative to your criterion for progress, and there can be disagreements. I listed criteria for progress that I felt were pretty uncontroversial, like, it's better to be alive than dead, it's better not to starve than to starve, it's better to be literate than illiterate. But there can be disagreements. So for example, is economic equality a criterion of progress? If the world has gotten richer but more unequal, and let's say poor people are less poor, but rich people are way, 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 way richer, is that inherently bad? There you do have a value judgment. In Enlightenment Now, I suggested that inequality per se is not a good criterion for progress, that the appropriate criterion is how well do people at the bottom do, not what is the gap between people at the top and the bottom. That should be obvious in the case of, say, longevity. If some people live to 100 and other people only make it to 70, is that worse than if everyone dies at 50 or 40 or 30? I think everyone would agree, no, it's better that if the people with the shortest lives live to 70, who cares if there's some people living to 100? If you're living to 70, that's better than living to 50. I would argue the same thing is true of wealth, that economic inequality is not an issue, poverty is the issue. But other people would say, but that's just one example of how the question, has there been progress, does depend on what do you count as progress. My argument is there are so many things that are not controversial that we can meaningfully ask the question, has there been progress, simply because there is so much agreement. It's better to be alive than dead, better to be healthy than sick, it's better to be well-fed than starving, better to be literate than illiterate. At the margins, there can be disagreements.
The last question, who has it? Here.
Hi. Thanks a lot for showcasing all of these positive trends. This was very nice to see.
Where should I be looking? I'm sorry.
Sorry, here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, yes.
Yeah. But there was something that I think was already tangentially touched by other questions, which is that I guess makes me a bit skeptical still, which is that as humanity's willingness to, let's say, exert violence has dropped, so has humanity's ability to cause large damage increase. So for example, I don't mean just nuclear weapons, but damage to climate, to I guess, for example, social media that can spread bad ideas, like, you know, fake news, misinformation, and so I feel like this is something that has never happened before. Somehow, up to now, damage was kind of localized, and now it can be really global. So do you have any thoughts on, even if progress is unstoppable, could it not just be other factors could come in and disrupt the whole thing?
So there are a bunch of different things there. It's sometimes been said that people who try to solve problems try to separate different aspects of the problem and work on them individually. People who are more fatalistic tend to think that everything is one big problem, and sometimes they're just kind of intimidated into passivity. So I do think it's important, say, not to conflate the problem of fake news from social media with the problem of climate. They're really, really different. Fake news is the default. Fake news is not new. It used to be that all news was fake news. The miracles narrated in the Bible are all fake news. The conspiracy theories that led to witch hunts and pogroms and inquisitions were all based on fake news. It's actually real news that is the precious accomplishment of modernity, as like in the same way that scientific knowledge is a precious accomplishment after millennia of magical thinking and superstition and ignorance. So yes, social media, because they don't have the engineering that specs that have led to knowledge. In the case of science, it would be, let me take a step back. So I think the question should be inverted, not why do people believe false things, why is there false news, but why do any of us believe true things? How do we even get truth? It's so hard to discover. The answer is it has to be engineered in. That is, since we all have cognitive biases, since we all like to believe that we're right whether or not we are, the only way that collectively we've approached truth is by institutions that have been kind of hacked to try to weed out error and approach truth. Science is an example with falsifiability, empirical testing, peer review, open debate and criticism. Democracy with its checks and balances, separation of powers, constraints on executive power. Journalism with, or at least responsible journalism with editing and fact-checking and printing errors. The judicial system with the adversarial proceedings, prosecution and defense. Unless people design a system to try to push towards truth, it's guaranteed to be all magic and superstition and falsehood. So the thing about social media is that it was not engineered to align towards truth. It was engineered just for engagement, for eyeballs, for hours online. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that falsehood proliferates. Interesting exceptions in terms of new technological developments is Wikipedia, which it has its flaws, we all know that, but we all use it. And that's because Wikipedia was engineered to try to be aligned toward truth. Wikipedians subscribe to the 5 pillars like sourcing, objectivity, and so on. And an open question is, what will happen with AI? Now, at least so far, AI is, it hallucinates, and that's a whole other discussion that I'm interested in, is why hallucinations are so baked into AI. But it tends not to give conspiracy theories, fake news, the Pope endorses Donald Trump for president, the kinds of things that you do get on social media, QAnon. And possibly, again, people in this room probably know the facts better than I do, but the business model for AI is not sheer engagement how many minutes you spend using the system, but it's a product that the companies hope that other companies will adopt to solve problems. And that puts pressure on AI, at least in the direction of accuracy, both presumably in the composition of the training corpus, where probably more, I'm guessing, I don't know for a fact, more weight is given to Wikipedia pages in the New York Times than random Twitter posts. The fine-tuning and post-training to try to get it to be accurate and truthful, the human feedback, that there is an incentive to make it useful, to make it accurate, and that's why, at least it's possible, again, I don't know what direction it will go in, that AI will be a technology that will be unlike social media in the ratio of truth to falsehood. I'll just say one word about climate change. Totally different problem. But again, I think it's very important not to see a polycrisis. Everything is falling apart, everything is connected. That is, I think, not the way that people attain progress. You attain progress by dividing up the problems. In many measures of environmental quality, there has been progress. In measures of air quality other than greenhouse gas emissions, say in oxides of nitrogen, in carbon monoxide, in sulfur dioxide, in particulate matter, in virtually every developed country, the pollutants have gone down, water quality has improved, protected areas have improved, deforestation has slowed down. Greenhouse gases have not gone in the right direction, to put it mildly, but we're coming to see that the worst case scenarios, the scenarios that were on the verge of extinction, turn out to be a very extreme case engineered for maximum pessimism, namely that the world would go on an orgy of burning coal, and population would continue to increase exponentially, both because population is leveling off, possibly decreasing, and because the rate of adoption of coal has not accelerated. I think last year more new solar was added than coal. The worst case scenarios, the 8.5 scenario, is now considered to be extremely unlikely. That doesn't mean that the news about climate is good. It is definitely bad. But we also have reason to believe that solutions exist. That is, if there is an acceleration of technologies that deliver abundant clean energy, out of which this may be controversial in Germany, but I think it'll become less and less controversial. Nuclear power will have to be part of that. We're seeing that the world's appetite for energy is pretty much limitless. 10 years ago, the concept of the energy consumption of AI wasn't even a concept, or of crypto. Now we know that together with all the other uses for energy, there are these two new ones. So the solution, we have an idea of what the solution will have to look like. It's not going to be voluntary conservation. No one's going to do that, especially not China and India. The solution has to be making clean energy cheaper and more abundant than dirty energy, so people adopt clean energy in their own interests. We're not living in that world yet, but that is the aspiration. That has to be the goal. And it's not, I don't want to say it's going to happen. Maybe it won't happen, but it's possible.
So thank you so much, dear auditory. Thank you so much, Lord Stephen of Pinker. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much.